right. Well, this morning we're going to finish this chapter looking at the rest of the endocrine glands, and I want you to tell me something about the interaction between the hypothalamus and the posterior lobe of the pituitary. Somebody just discuss that to me. Does the posterior pituitary contain cells that make hormones? The answer to that is no. The hormones that we call posterior lobe hormones are those that are released by cells that extend into the posterior lobe from where? The hypothalamus. Okay. Anterior lobe, does it have cells that actually produce hormones? Yes. However, each one of those cells will not produce a hormone unless another hormone is there first. And what is that other hormone referred to as? A releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. So there's a good connection physically and physiologically between the hypothalamus and the pituitary. Okay? And we talked about last time several hormones produced by the anterior lobe and then the two released at the posterior lobe. So make sure that you can describe those hormones, what they do, where they come from, what causes them to be released, all that we talked about last time. Okay, today we're going to finish up the endocrine system, starting with the thyroid gland. Your thyroid gland is located in the lower part of your neck, just underneath your larynx. Here's your larynx. That's pronounced larynx, not larynx, by the way. Larynx. That's your voice box. So find your Adam's apple. That's the front part of that, and go right down from it. That would be the thyroid gland. So here's the thyroid, okay, and it wraps around that lower part of the larynx and the upper part of the trachea. If you look at it through the microscope, it is very unique in structure. It's the only endocrine gland like this in that the cells form big open areas called follicles. Okay, and so this is a thyroid follicle. There's a thyroid follicle. The cells around it produce some of the hormones, and then cells in between, like these, produce other hormones of the thyroid gland. But these follicles, under the microscope, that's the giveaway that you're looking at the thyroid. We'll see a slide of it in a moment. But inside the follicle is a non-living gel-like substance referred to as colloid, and some of the hormones can be temporarily stored there. We're going to see as we look at this that some of the hormones contain iodine, specifically the ones called thyroxine and triiodothyronine, or T4 and T3. Obviously, one of them has 4 iodines and one has 3 iodines. Okay, as far as I know, this is the only place in your body iodine is used. So one of the features of the thyroid is that it can take up iodine from blood. So these cells that surround the follicles, those are the ones that produce the T3 and T4. And those are the hormones that the thyroid gland is famous for, in that they control your metabolic rate. So if you produce a lot of those hormones, the T3 and T4, you have a fast metabolism. If you don't produce a whole lot, you have a slower metabolic rate. Okay? But there's another hormone produced by the extrafollicular cells, these, called calcitonin. And so obviously it affects your blood calcium levels. And the way it does that is by acting on other organ systems to cause that calcium to lower. So in a moment we'll look at that a little bit. Well, I'll go on and talk about that one now. Calcitonin, and then we're going to spend a little more time on T3 and T4. But let's say calcitonin, one way it lowers blood calcium is by acting on your bones. Do you remember there are 2 cells when we talked about bone development, and one built bone and one broke down bone? Which cells produce bone? Osteoblast and then osteoclast break down bone. Okay, in order for osteoblasts to function, they have to have calcium, because one of the things they're putting in bone is calcium phosphate, right? So do you see how the calcitonin could activate osteoblast? blasts, which take the calcium from the blood and store it in bone. So that lowers your blood calcium. See that? Also, it can affect the kidneys by causing the kidneys to remove calcium from the blood. And then in an indirect way, it affects the intestines to limit the absorption of calcium from the foods that you eat. Okay, so it acts on those three organ systems. Okay. All right, and so here you can see where the thyroid gland is in relation to the other endocrine structures. And then highlighted in the right, you can see different regions of the thyroid. You don't have to know the different lobes of it. But here you see it through the microscope. And so you can see some of the follicles. Some are large, some are small. But then that material in the middle is the colloid. Okay. So the extrafollicular cells, this would be some, this would be one right there. The follicular cells are just some cuboidal cells. Don't cuboidal cells secrete? Okay, and they sometimes when we order microscope slides in A&P1 for simple cuboidal epithelium, it's thyroid gland slides because these follicular cells, these right here, are cuboidal. That's interesting. Okay, and then here's some other views of the thyroid gland. So this is real easy to recognize because you see those big open follicles. Okay, now if somebody produces an elevated amount of the T3 and T4, then they have an extra fast metabolic rate, and that condition is called hyperthyroidism. If someone doesn't produce enough of the thyroid hormones, and by thyroid hormones, I'm not talking about calcitonin, I'm talking about the others. Okay, if they produce a deficient amount of those, then that's hypothyroidism. So let's look at some of the symptoms that could be associated with that. For hypothyroidism, just think about it. If you don't produce enough of the T3 and T4, your metabolic rate is low. So that means chemical reactions occur more slowly in your cells and outside your cells. So because of that, because you're not undergoing as many chemical reactions, you're not losing heat from those molecules as much. So you get cold very easily. You're tired because you're not generating enough energy through adequate cell respiration. So you get very tired. Because everything's broken down slowly, if molecules, your food molecules, when they get to your cells, if they're not broken down efficiently, they're just going to be stored as fat. So people with hypothyroidism they really struggle with their weight. Sometimes it's very hard for them to lose weight. They may have not a big appetite, yet they still tend to be gaining some weight. If a child is born with underactive thyroid gland, that can be devastating because the metabolic rate is slow at a time when it needs to be awfully high. All right, and that condition is called cretinism. So it can affect their physical growth. It can affect the nervous system development. So this shows a child who has cretinism, and then this one is in your book. So even though these children were born decades apart, do you see how they have some similar facial features? A lot of disorders, they could be hormonal disorders or chromosome disorders that affect embryonic and fetal development, tend to cause some similar external features, especially in the face. Like like with Down syndrome, all people with Down syndrome share some common facial features, don't they? It's because that condition affects the development of that area. The same way with cretinism. Now, if just the opposite of hypothyroidism would be hyperthyroidism, so everything deals with, all the symptoms are because of a very quick, fast metabolic rate. So they're breaking down, so they're releasing lots of heat, so they get hot all the time. They tend to be restless. They have a hard time gaining weight. I don't know why, but there's buildup of tissue behind the eyes, so it tends to make the eyes look like they're bulging. Just because somebody has eyes that look bulging doesn't mean they have that. But this is one of the features that you sometimes see. Because their thyroid is very active, it starts enlarging. And an enlarged thyroid gland, for whatever reason it's enlarging, is called a goiter. An enlarged thyroid gland, because of hyperthyroidism, is referred to as an exophthalmic goiter. We'll talk about the other goiter in a minute. Okay, so here's some pictures. A couple of women. See, her eyes are real bulging. But on this next slide, this is the one in your book. Look at her thyroid gland in the thyroid area. See how that's bulging? Okay. So if somebody has that, a lot of times they'll remove the thyroid. You hear about people having the thyroid gland removed, but they have to take thyroid medication the rest of their lives. A real common one is Synthroid. Some of you may have heard of Synthroid. Sometimes people who have hypothyroidism have to take Synthroid to bump it up. You know. It's hard to get that regulated perfectly. Okay, here you can see the thyroxine T4 on the left and triiodothyronine on the right. And so do you see how their structures are very similar? The big difference is how many iodines are attached. If you don't have enough iodine in your diet, you're not going to be able to make these hormones. Okay, so look at this woman. She definitely has a goiter. But this type of goiter is called an endemic. It can be humongous. Sometimes you see this in entire little communities of people, not because it's contagious, but because they all don't get enough iodine in their diet. And so the thyroid gland, it's overcompensating. It's trying to produce the hormones, but it can't. So it enlarges, so they got this huge goiter, yet they have symptoms of hypothyroidism. Doesn't she look tired? Yeah. The remedy for this one is real easy. Guess what it is? Put iodine in the diet. So sometimes we don't see this around here as much in developed countries, but like, let's say if this woman, she looks maybe South American, like maybe she's from Peru, some of the mountainous areas of Peru, in isolated little communities, they may not be. Well, but do you see? He said, why can't they just go out and get some fish? Good point. Seafood contains a lot of iodine, but this may be a little mountainous community that's far away from the sea, and they may not import their food. They may grow their own crops, and the soil is deficient of iodine. All right, and so the fix for that is just iodized salt. This is the reason we have iodized salt. Just get iodine in the diet. I've seen a picture. You could probably Google it and find pictures where it shows whole little communities of people where most of them have goiters. Some humongous, some smaller. But it's simply because they don't get enough iodine. Okay. All right. If you did not learn anything in our last time together, I hope that you learned that the pituitary gland produces some hormones that in turn can affect other endocrine glands, and tell them when to release hormones. Okay, an example of that is the hormone from the anterior pituitary called thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. Where is it made? Anterior pituitary. But remember, it won't be produced unless there's a releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. Okay, so the hypothalamus produces a releasing hormone that in turn has target cells in the anterior lobe of the pituitary. And when the releasing hormone gets there, it tells those cells to produce their hormone, in this case TSH. And its target cells are in the thyroid gland. So TSH then turns on the thyroid gland and starts making the metabolic hormones, T3 and T4. As long as you have enough of those hormones, that's going to shut this whole thing off. So there's an interaction between three endocrine glands there. The hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, and the thyroid. And it's controlled through a negative feedback. If your metabolic rate is already high, then that shuts this off. If the metabolic rate is low, it tries to turn it on. Or if the level of the thyroid hormones is high or low. Okay? So be able to explain that to me one day. All right, so that's the thyroid gland. So it produces T3 and T4, which affect your metabolic rate. And then it also produces calcitonin. And what does calcitonin do? Ah, it lowers blood calcium by acting on various organs. Okay, has target cells in various places. Okay, the next organ is one that you may not have ever heard of. It's called the parathyroid gland, but you have four of these, and they're located on the back side of the thyroid gland. So what you're seeing over here on the right, there's the esophagus right here, and there's the trachea in front of it. So you're looking at it from behind, and then the pharynx is up above the esophagus. That's the lower part of your throat there. But here's thyroid gland, and so it's wrapping around all of that, but it doesn't wrap completely. But notice on the posterior surface you have four tiny little organs. They don't have anything to do with the thyroid, they just sit there. Okay, but they're called the parathyroid glands. Here you can see them under the microscope. This one's difficult under the microscope. Supposedly, the classic feature is you see a cord, C-O-R-D, cord-like pattern of the cells. But anyway, that's parathyroid, and it produces one hormone. The name's real hard. It's called parathyroid hormone, okay? Or you can call it parathormone or PTH, okay? And you can see in your notes on the page before this that it says it also affects calcium levels, but instead of lowering them like calcitonin, it raises your blood calcium levels. By acting on those same three target cells, it just has the opposite effect. So instead of activating osteoblasts, it's going to activate osteoclasts. Osteoclasts break down bone, and as it's broken down, it releases calcium from the bone to get into the blood. So it raises blood calcium, which you need. Let's say if you need calcium for blood clotting or for muscle contraction, you can get it out of the bones. Okay. It affects the kidneys because it causes the kidneys to send out chemicals that activate vitamin D in the skin. This is all a roundabout, real complicated mechanism. But once that vitamin D is activated, that in turn causes the intestines to be able to absorb calcium from the foods you eat. So basically, it raises blood calcium. Okay, so you need to know that parathyroid hormone raises blood calcium, whereas calcitonin lowers, and together they work to keep your calcium levels just where they need to be, so you'll have enough calcium for all these processes that go on in the body. Okay, it took me a while to figure out how to determine which one raised and which one lowered blood calcium, and I don't have any good clue for you at all, but this is what I did to never miss this question and never mess up when I'm standing in front of class. One day on my way to school many years ago, I was about to teach this, and I just simply in my mind and out loud, I said it for like 15 minutes, my whole drive to school. I said calcitonin lowers blood calcium. I mean, I just said it again and again and again and again. So now every time the word calcitonin comes to my mind, immediately I think lowers blood calcium. And that's just what I did. I can't tell you any other trick for this one. But you need to know which is which raises, which lowers. Okay? All right. I have a dear friend who has had 2 or 3 of her parathyroid glands removed because she's had massive problems with kidney stones, so much so that it's caused kidneys to get inflamed and infected, and she's had one removed, and she still has kidney stones every few months in the other one, and she's not a candidate for a kidney transplant because there's nothing wrong with her kidneys, it's just they can't get these calcium levels regulated. So it's a hormonal thing. She's had her thyroid gland removed. She's had some of the parathyroids removed to try to self-regulate. But anyway, but do you see if you had parathyroids over producing calcitonin, that increases blood calcium, and the way your kidneys are going to compensate for that is to try to pull it out. So don't think too much about kidney action on this. It's real complicated. But one of the functions of the kidneys is to remove any excess chemical out of your blood. And so if calcium is removed out of your blood and put in urine, it's not very soluble. So if you have a lot of it, it's going to result in a kidney stone. And, I had another friend who had to have parathyroid glands removed, not because she was having kidney stones. It's surprising she didn't, but she was having bone loss as a result of elevated parathyroid hormone. Does that make sense? Because it activates osteoclast, breaks down bone. So you don't hear about this endocrine gland very much, do you? But if you've got problems with it, it can cause all kinds of issues in the body. Okay. So this is showing you the interaction of the parathyroid glands with these other organs, and it's also controlled through a negative feedback. All right, our next organ would be the adrenal glands. They sit on top of the kidneys. So here's a kidney, and then here's a kidney, and what you see in pink is the adrenal glands. And they just are like a little cap on top of the kidneys. They don't really have anything to do with the kidneys. It's sort of like parathyroid and thyroid. They just sit there. And anterior and posterior pituitary. They don't have anything to do with each other, really. They just are right side by side. Okay. And here's some other views of it. Okay. I want you to notice on this middle picture. Okay, here's the adrenal gland sitting on top of the kidney. And then here's a sectioned view of it. I want you to notice that there's two distinct regions. See this region and then all of this region. The outer region is called the adrenal cortex, and the inner region is called the adrenal medulla. Do you remember in AMP1 when we were looking at a long bone and all the parts of a long bone? Remember that medullary cavity? That word medullary comes from the word medulla. It means middle. Okay? So here's the adrenal medulla and then the adrenal cortex. And notice, if you look at this view, in the cortex, there's various regions or zones of the cortex. You're not going to have to name the zones for me for a test. But I want you to look overall. Do you see how it kind of looks like the cells are lined up? And because of that arrangement of cells, this area sometimes looks a little bit striated, not nearly like muscle tissue, but that's how you can recognize it under the microscope. Whereas in the medulla, it's just kind of lumpy looking, the cells are. Well, the cortex produces different hormones than the medulla does. And the adrenal cortex hormones are all steroid hormones. You produce steroid hormones in two organs, the gonads, ovaries or testes, and the adrenal cortex produces steroids. Not necessarily sex steroids, but still steroids. Okay? Whereas the medulla produces other kinds of some non-steroid hormones. So let's look at the adrenal cortex first and look at some of the hormones they produce. Aldosterone is one whose target cells are in the kidneys. And what it causes to happen at the kidneys is it causes the kidneys to save sodium, so you don't excrete it in the urine, but at the same time secrete potassium. Y'all remember when we did nerve impulse transmission? Remember how sodium was on the outside, potassium on the inside? And if sodium moved in, what did potassium do? Moved out. And that was simply to keep the potential here, the charge the same on the membrane. Okay, that is a common thing with ions all over the place inside of you. When something positive moves one way across a membrane, another positive one counteracts that by moving in the opposite direction. If a negative ion moves in one direction, another negative is going to move in the opposite direction. Well, here you're seeing that at the kidneys with sodium and potassium again. So if you're saving sodium, it's going to counteract that by releasing potassium. Usually those levels are opposite. Okay? Wherever sodium goes in the body, water tends to follow. So in a roundabout way, aldosterone causes you to retain water. Okay, technically it's acting on the sodium and the potassium. Okay, the trigger for aldosterone release is an elevated blood potassium level, because it's going to get rid of that blood potassium, but as a side effect of that, you gain sodium, okay, and water. Okay. All right, then cortisol is named because it's in the cortex, but cortisol is has a lot of different actions, but the two test actions, the kind of everyday action is to convert fats and proteins into carbohydrates in your cells. Let's say if you've used up all your available glucose in a cell, and then the storage form of glucose called glycogen, you've used that up, and you still need something to break down through cell respiration, cortisol can help with that because it can convert other molecules that aren't carbohydrates into glucose. Okay, so it elevates your glucose levels. But what it's more famous for is what it does in high concentrations, and that's to reduce inflammation. So this is, you hear about cortisone shots and cortisone creams. Those come from this hormone. And when does a person need cortisone cream, like hydrocortisone? Let's say they have a skin rash. All right, it reduces that inflammation. If somebody has cortisone shots, like they have bursitis and their bursa or swelling, or their joint cavities swell because they produce a lot of synovial fluid, that's very painful. They get a cortisone shot, that reduces the inflammation. Okay. And then the adrenal androgens. An androgen is a category of hormones that testosterone is a part of. So these are the male sex hormones. And in females, these can also be, in males too, can be converted to estrogens. So ladies, you do produce androgens. Guys, you do produce some estrogens. Okay, but it's at the adrenal cortex. Okay. All right, so make sure you know all of these are steroids at the cortex. They're all steroids. Okay, in the adrenal medulla, these hormones are real famous. You hear about adrenaline and noradrenaline, especially adrenaline. You hear about adrenaline. There's also another name for adrenaline called epinephrine, and there's another name for noradrenaline called norepinephrine. Okay, now in AMP1, one of the last things we did was look at the nervous system, and we talked about a few neurotransmitters, but I did not talk about these. But epinephrine and norepinephrine also chemically can act like neurotransmitters. If they're released by a neuron and then go to another cell and affect sodium or potassium gates, they act as neurotransmitters. And the neurons that release epinephrine and norepinephrine are those motor neurons of the sympathetic division of the nervous system. And so they cause all these sympathetic responses like increase in heart rate, breathing rate, sweat gland activity, all the sympathetic responses. If the adrenal medulla produces that chemical, instead of it affecting sodium and potassium gates on a cell, it's going to get into the bloodstream and go to target cells. But it has the same effect of increase in heart rate, blood pressure, all this. Okay, and so its effects are similar to the effects of the sympathetic division of the nervous system. And this is a huge link between nervous and endocrine systems. It's the same chemical. Sometimes it's neurotransmitter, depends on what cells release it. Sometimes it acts as a hormone. Okay, so in your, I don't know that, did I put the table in your notes? I did, good. Okay, in your book, you see this table, and here's the effects of these. Do you see how these are hormonal effects of these two chemicals? But do you see how they're pretty much identical to sympathetic nervous system effects? Okay, and you don't have to pinpoint these. You don't have to describe these individually. Just know that the effects are similar to those of sympathetic nervous system. Okay. and that's from the adrenal medulla. Okay, and so another hormone that was one of the control hormones at the pituitary, anterior pituitary, besides TSH, was ACTH. And remember, that one stood for adrenocorticotropic hormone. Okay, so it affects the adrenal cortex. Okay, that's why it's called adrenal corticotropic. Here it is. This is from the anterior lobe of the pituitary, anterior pituitary. But it won't be produced unless there's a releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, right? Okay, and so once ACTH is released, gets into the bloodstream, its target cells are in the adrenal cortex, and specifically it's in the cortex, that the area that produces the cortisol. And so cortisol levels rise because cortisol causes all kinds of things to happen. But if you have enough of that, it acts as a brake. So again, it's just a negative feedback of an interaction between three different endocrine areas. Okay. Okay. All right, then the next organ is one you all have heard of. The pancreas is a unique endocrine gland in that it has just as big a role in the body with the digestive system. So it's an exocrine gland to produce pancreatic juice. It's loaded with digestive enzymes. And those juices move into ducts in the pancreas and then go to the small intestine. But scattered throughout the pancreas are areas, little pockets of cells that produce hormones that are released into the bloodstream. So it's endocrine and exocrine. We'll look at its exocrine role when we get to the digestive system chapter. Okay. Today we're going to look at the endocrine role. And so just stay on this page. Okay, here you see, over here, there's the pancreas, kind of a feather-shaped organ. It's got this huge old duct in it and all those little lobes. All right, and if you looked at little details microscopically, okay, do you see how some of these cells are releasing into ducts? Those are the exocrine. So they have digestive enzymes in them. We're not going to talk about those in this chapter. But look at this little pocket of cells. In this little pocket, there are no ducts associated with that. That is called an islet of Langerhans, or you can call it a pancreatic islet, islet of Langerhans. All right, and that's what produces the hormones. So in the view on the left, that's an color enhanced micrograph. So do you see this little group of cells looks different than all the others? That is an islet of Langerhans. All these other cells are the exocrine areas. Here's another view. All right, and so that the islets of Langerhans just look different than that's the best way to describe it. Just a little group that looks different than most of the others. Okay. All right. Now the hormones that they make. The famous hormone is insulin. There are a few hormones produced at the pancreas. We're just going to look at two of them. But insulin is a hormone that causes, it has target cells pretty much everywhere. But when insulin binds to a target cell, that cell then glucose can move through it. So it can take glucose from the blood and put it in that cell. So do you see how in kind of that roundabout way it lowers your blood glucose levels? Okay. But if blood glucose is high and the glucose doesn't go anywhere, it doesn't do you any good. It's got to get in your cells. Insulin allows it to go to the cells. So it lowers blood glucose, and then another thing, because it causes it to move into the cells, but once it gets to the cells, if the glucose is not broken down immediately through cellular respiration, it can be combined with other glucoses to form animal starch called glycogen. So it converts glucose to glycogen. Glycogen is another carbohydrate. It's our storage form for glucose. Okay. All right, then glucagon is the second hormone we're going to look at. It does the opposite of insulin. It raises blood glucose And the way it does that is taking that glycogen, breaking it down into individual glucoses, and now that glucose can move into the blood. Okay, so you have a lot of glycogen storage in your liver cells, in your skeletal muscle cells, maybe not so much in your skin cells. But let's say other cells of the body need some glucose. Well, glucagon can cause the glycogen in your storage areas to break down and release that glucose so it's available to the other cells. Okay, so it raises blood glucose. Insulin's one of the more famous hormones as far as people have heard its name. You know, and estrogen and progesterone are the other two, but and testosterone. Uh, but a lot of people struggle with their insulin levels or their insulin action. Okay, and you've all heard of diabetes. I'm not going to test you on diabetes, but there's good descriptions of it in your book, and I've got some of this in your notes. But diabetes is a very serious condition that, in one way or another, glucose is not able to get to your cells. Okay, and because of that, you're going to have all kinds of issues. All right, but sometimes, because you have um, elevated blood glucose, it's just not being able to get to your cells. You may have an elevated blood glucose, and remember how I mentioned a minute ago, your kidneys remove excess from your blood. If you have too much glucose in your blood, your kidneys can remove it. So a classic sign of diabetes is glucose in the urine, and so that's one of the first tests they do for that with the urinalysis. Anyway, that elevated blood glucose, you may have heard of that, is hyperglycemia. And that could be a little temporary thing. You could have just had a super high carbohydrate meal and have a little temporary hyperglycemia, but then your insulin kicks in and moves it into your cells. There's two kinds of diabetes, type 1 and type 2. You've probably heard of that. Type 1 diabetes is the classic juvenile diabetes, and that's when a person does not produce enough insulin, and that's an autoimmune disease. Your immune system, you start producing antibodies against your own cells, and the cells you're producing antibodies against are those of the pancreas that make insulin, so they don't produce enough insulin. Okay, so the fix for that, it sounds like a simple fix, it's not quite so simple, is to get insulin. So maybe through insulin injections or an insulin pump. Okay. With type 2 diabetes, which is rampant here in Mississippi, that's more the adult onset diabetes. And basically, you may produce enough insulin, but something's going on with the target cells. Maybe the insulin's not able to bind to the receptors. Something's interfering with the binding of it. So again, your blood glucose skyrockets and it's not able to get to your cells. So you have some of the same symptoms as not producing enough insulin at all. But obesity can trigger it. And so one of the first solutions for it or treatments for it is weight loss. But we see a lot of that here in Mississippi. Another treatment for that one is diet, is to get some of the carbohydrates out of the diet, with both of them actually, but especially with the type 2. So I guarantee you will be dealing with patients with type 2 diabetes if you work here. I've told you that my daughter's a nurse, and when she was in her undergrad nursing program, all of her clinicals, she was at Delta State, and her clinicals were in the Mississippi Delta, and almost every patient she saw was hypertensive and diabetic. Almost every one of them, and that was the root of all their evils, and with medically. Scary, very scary. Yes. Mellitus, diabetes mellitus. Mm-hmm. Oh, oh, mellitus. I've always heard diabetes mellitus. She asked, "How do you pronounce that?" It doesn't. It's not spelled like it would be pronounced that way, but that's how I've always heard it. Oh, well, look it up before you don't rely on me. Okay, okay, all right. Uh, so this shows you some of the treatments for it, and again, I'm not going to test you on diabetes, but you probably all know someone who's diabetic. You may have diabetes in your family, and if you have it in your family, there's a chance you could get it. So the type 2 a lot of times can be controlled with your lifestyle. Not always, but it can be helped with that. Some people are going to be more prone to getting it. There's another diabetes that's gestational diabetes that some women that gets triggered during pregnancy, and sometimes after the baby's born it goes away. Sometimes it doesn't. But so that's a third kind that's not shown there in your book. Okay, now the gonads, that's the other name for those. That's the name for your primary sex organs, which in females would be the ovaries, males would be the testes. By primary sex organ, that means the ones that produce the sex cells. Okay, we obviously are going to talk a whole lot more about those organs when we get to the reproductive system. But for now, all I want you to know about them is that, like the pancreas, they're endocrine and they're exocrine. Their endocrine secretion would be the steroid hormones that are famous. The exocrine secretion would be the egg and the sperm. Okay, and the hormones are steroids, just like the adrenal cortex hormones are steroids, but these are the sex steroids. Females produce, of course, estrogen and progesterone, and the males produce testosterone. And like the thyroid hormones and like the adrenal cortex hormones, they are regulated, but their release is regulated by a hormone from the anterior lobe of the pituitary called the gonadotropins. There were two of those, but you don't have to name them individually. You just call them gonadotropins. They won't be released unless there's a releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. Okay, and then once the gonadotropins are released, then they tell the gonads when to make their hormones. Okay, sometimes a woman may struggle with the menstrual cycle, and there's nothing wrong with her ovaries. It's a pituitary issue. So this is why. It's because of this interaction. Okay, the thymus gland. Most people don't know this one exists, but this is a very interesting organ. A lot of students confuse it with thyroid. Number one, they both start with TH, and number two, they're kind of in the neck area, except the thyroid is in the neck. The thymus is in your mediastinum. It's in the body cavity. Remember, the mediastinum is the space in between the lungs, and the thymus gland sits just above the pericardial sac. And when you are born, here's an infant. When you're born, it is a lot bigger than as you get older. Okay, so it actually gets smaller as you get older, and it produces a hormone called thymosin. I'm sure this is in your slides there, but thymosin. And we'll look at this hormone a little bit more when we get to another chapter. But before you're ever born, y'all can put your pencils down. I'm not going to test you on this. Just listen. Before you're ever born, your early bone marrow produces some white blood cells called lymphocytes. Okay, we haven't done blood yet, but we're about to in the next unit. But you've got one kind of blood cell called a lymphocyte. But before you're born, they're all just alike, all the lymphocytes, when you're early embryo fetus. All right, but then some of them get influenced by the hormone thymosin and go on to specialize a little bit into a type of lymphocyte called the T lymphocyte. The other ones that don't get influenced become B lymphocytes. They just mature in the bone marrow. So they're not affected by the thymus gland. Okay? And then T cells have T lymphocytes do one part of your immune response. B cells do another part of your immune response. But they work together to give you this thing called immunity. All right. Once a B or a T cell is made, it can divide to produce other ones. And so once you have your first T cells, you don't really need thymosin anymore, because then they start dividing, which divide to produce other T cells. And once you're a T cell, you can't go back and be a B cell. All right? And so do you see how you don't need this organ as much as you get older? You need it more early in life. And it gets smaller and smaller and smaller as you get older. It's interesting. But I read a study one time that they did with some little mice, and they removed the thymus gland in different mice at different ages. And like they would take the little tiny newborn mice, remove the thymus gland, and then let a mouse, they get mature in just a few weeks. But let's say at 2 months they removed it, and the ones that they removed early on they basically didn't have an immune system. But the ones that they removed once they reached maturity, they were just like any other mouse. Okay. All right. Oops. Okay, and so there, that shows you the little bit you've got to know about this. Okay. All right. And then the pineal gland we talked about as a part of the brain, which it is. It's part of the diencephalon. And so here you see it highlighted in orange back there. And it produces a hormone you may have heard of called melatonin. Y'all ever heard of melatonin? If you went to the health food store and got you some, or the drugstore and got some melatonin, why would you be doing that? To help you sleep. Okay. Melatonin affects your day-night cycles, which we call your circadian rhythms. Ours are not quite as obvious and drastic as some animals, but think about the migratory birds. You know, they fly south for the winter. It's not necessarily because the air temperature has gotten colder. It's because the length of day has lessened. Your production of this hormone has to do with the length of day, which helps us with our sleep-wake cycles. Okay. Anyway, some people have more drastic circadian rhythms than others, and that also can affect your mood a little bit. Have you ever heard of some people have depression in the wintertime but not in the summer? You ever heard of that? It has to do with the length of the day, and it affects this in some way or another. And I don't know anything really about this one, but it does affect your body's response to day and night, which does affect your sleep cycles. Okay. All right. All right. I want to. I think this is about the last thing. Okay. One of the things that you hear about in the news sometimes is people taking steroids when they shouldn't, or taking hormones when they should not. Especially you see this with some athletes who, they get a lot of money if they win. And I mean, it's sort of a catch-22. If you don't do the illegal things, you're not going to be as likely to win. However, it is illegal because it can drastically affect your health. Here you can see the abuse of steroids. Athletes take steroids, of course, to increase their muscle and bone mass, which improves athletic performance. But look at some of these side effects if you have too much. And it can cause death because it can affect the heart. And over time, it could cause someone to have a heart attack at an early age. Human growth hormone is also illegal to take that. And then erythropoietin is one you've never heard of, but it's one of the hormones that we'll study in another unit. Remember I told you we won't be finished with endocrine system in this chapter? We'll talk about some hormones produced in other areas of the body that we don't necessarily consider an endocrine gland. Erythropoietin is a hormone that causes you to make red blood cells, and some athletes take that to produce more red blood cells. Red blood cells are the ones that carry oxygen to your cells, so it makes more oxygen available. Kind of makes sense. But if you start producing too many red blood cells, your blood gets too thick, and some people have had strokes because of this, and blood clots form because of this. And that's called blood doping. You ever heard of blood doping? It's scary. It's scary. Some people have blood doping because they just get transfusions of blood, but there's always a chance of infection for that. Some people do auto transfusions where they have their own blood removed, but during that time they're kind of sick because they've lost a little blood, so they can't exercise during that point. So I don't know. Anyway, then they get it transfused back into them, but they can do anything. Yes. She said, can they use erythropoietin as a substitute for blood transfusions like during surgery? Uh, I it you would think possibly, but you're still going to have the chance of the blood being too thick if you did that. So I don't really know the answer to that question. So they may have had that. Okay. Oh, got it. Yeah, she thinks that her cousin may have to take this sometimes because of sickle cell, and maybe so in that case. Um, we all struggle at times with stress in our lives. There's physical stress and there's mental stress or physiological stress, but they can cause all kinds of medical issues. And if we look at the different types of stress, especially the physiological and the emotional stress, let's just look at what happens. Now, your body is a homeostatic organism. It's if you have conditions move in one direction, your body's going to make changes to put it back. It's just constant. And so when you are under stress, you're automatically going to start releasing a lot of sympathetic impulses, and look at all the effects, the short-term little sympathetic nervous system effects. But it also is going to cause the brain to release the releasing hormone that causes the pituitary to produce ACTH, which then causes cortisol release. And the elevated cortisol is going to increase glucose levels um, because of, like where it says increased release of fatty acids, which can then be converted to glucose, and increased blood concentration of amino acids, which can be converted to glucose. But all of that, in turn, can trigger some more sympathetic responses with the adrenal medulla. But over time, this can cause problems, especially with that increase in the heart rate and the blood pressure. So look at some of these signals that occur. I mean, it happens all over. It's not just cortisol. I mean, look at, you've got epinephrine, and then all the stuff with the cortisol. And here's glucagon. We got to get your blood glucose has to go up to do all of those things like elevated heart rate and all that. ADH, which is causing your kidneys to retain water. So you see a lot of water retention. We haven't talked about renin, which is an enzyme, but it sets off a cascade of reactions that ultimately results in aldosterone release. Do you see how this stress really affects your endocrine system and can cause a lot of problems? I'm not going to test you on any of these. I'm not going to test you on stress, but I want you to see this. Okay? And the better you can remove stress from your life, the healthier you're going to be. Which is hard to do, I realize, when you're working full time, taking A&P. You have family members you've got to deal with. I realize that. But stress is a big deal, a really big deal on your health. Okay. All right, now we finished super early today, which seems like this chapter is makes it seem pretty short, but it is just as important on your test as chapter 12. Okay, as far as number of questions, for each of these hormones, the minimum thing you have to know about them is what organ produces them and what they cause to happen in the body. On many of these, if you know what it causes to happen, you can figure out a trigger for its release. Like if it lowers blood glucose, then the trigger would be an elevated blood glucose, wouldn't it? Okay. Um, and then, the interaction between the pituitary and some of these, make sure you can know that. Okay. All right.